Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Today we're looking at one of the fastest growing sectors on the African continent. Hello and welcome, I'm Nozi Pombanjwa. Now, mobile connectivity has played one of the foremost roles in creating an economically driven, globally competitive and socially uplifted Africa. Joining us today to discuss the opportunities and the challenges in the telecom space is Richard Hurst, who's a senior analyst at Ovum, and Willem Marais, CEO of Liquid Telecom South Africa. Gentlemen, thank you for making the time to join us. Richard, just remind us again of the lay of the land. How would you describe the development of the telecom space within the continent broadly, and also perhaps juxtapositioning that with how you would describe the South African context?
I'd say we're at clearly different stages of development, the South African versus the other African operations. But we've certainly moved from that period of, dare I call it, the pioneering days of mobile, and you can see that there's a degree of maturity creeping into our African markets. Revenue growth is slowing, subscriber growth is slowing, that type of thing. But that does not mean that there's no opportunity out there in the telecom space.
Willem, if we take a look at Liquid Telecom, the footprint is quite extensive and you have a presence in different geographies on the African continent. Using the broad brushstroke that Richard has given us, which markets do you think are still the front leaders when it comes to telecoms uptake, and where do you think the markets of the future are likely to be?
Thanks, Nazi. So Liquid Telecom is a fixed line operator by all means. We focus on wholesale, enterprise and retail, and very specifically targeting markets that historically have been underserved. So today we're active in 12 different African countries, very present in Southern, Central and East Africa. There's a continuous requirement for building out core terrestrial fiber network assets to connect both the submarine cable infrastructure as well as the mobile networks in terms of a transmission network backhaul facility. And on the back of that, there's a number of additional business models that could be developed to use that same infrastructure, whether that be for enterprise or retail services.
Let's stay on the infrastructure note, and just to continue on that with you, Willem. What are investors looking for before they put down infrastructure in the various markets, and are you getting it when you get there?
Yeah, certainly, it's a very capital-intensive build. So what one needs to ensure is that you sign up one or two different anchor tenants that would be seen as key off-takers of those assets that you build. That then creates the foundation on top of which you would make your investment, and you would then start looking at additional revenue streams that you can build over and above that infrastructure.
Richard, so that's the practical response of what's happening on the ground. Theoretically, where are we when it comes to investing in telecoms infrastructure? Are governments looking at this and saying this is a policy priority and therefore an investment priority when it comes to the public purse?
Funny, we were actually just talking about that prior to coming on the show, and the sense that we're getting, both Willem and myself, is that governments understand the need for increased investment in telecoms infrastructure, but they'd rather pull back and allow the private sector to play a role. And we've seen that in Nigeria, Ghana, etc. There are still government initiatives out there, but they seem to be a very secondary role. I don't know, perhaps Willem would give me a better view.
Yeah, certainly, Richard, I'll add to that. I think the challenge that government sits with is the ability to then commercialize those assets. Right. They certainly have the means to invest, roll out the infrastructure. It's important for a government as a mandate to provide broadband services to its citizen, but it's the ongoing commercialization of those assets. And government's now starting to look at special purpose business vehicles with private sector to build these types of infrastructure.
Could regulation unlock some of these opportunities? Should we be reviewing the regulatory framework that governs the telecom space?
Well, each African state have their own different regulatory environment, but I would say that there is this move to where they're going to give consideration to things such as the passive network infrastructure sharing, that type of thing. But just the how and why and the practical implications thereof, I think that's eluding our regulators right now.
It's eluding the regulators, but I'm sure it's a big issue on the table, Richard, when it comes to on-the-ground experience. What's your view of the regulatory landscape that governs the businesses that you run and the businesses that you'd like to build in the future?
As Richard says, it really differs country by country. One of the big challenges, of course, is cross-border business.
Yeah.
So you could, get a regulator to support in terms of licensing conditions to build that physical infrastructure in a specific country. But it's when you get to the cross-border business and how that is then regulated, which sometimes is of a challenge.
We're always talking about African integration, though, so I'm perplexed that we're still having the same conversation about cross-border opportunities. Are we still stuck in just these really nice policy papers and really nice declarations, and we're just not unable to cross borders when it comes to something like this?
The cross-border thing, I think that it's slow because it's the two governments need to come to an agreement, and as we know, it's weighed down with bureaucratic red tape, that type of thing. So it's not as agile and smooth as the more the private investments. But the thing is that you still have to have the government sign off to do these cross-border transmissions.
Maybe, Willem, let's move from the governments, give them a bit of a breathing space, and let's take a quick look at the consumer. I mean, if we take a look at the demographics of the African continent, every report on the telecom space will tell you that investors are looking to capture this rising middle class that we have on the continent. But Richard said right at the beginning that there's a maturation in the market, and subscriber numbers aren't going to make sure that you have revenues of the future. So how are you seeing the African middle class, and where do you think this is likely to take the telecom space?
So very quick high-level statistics. African continent, over 1.1 billion people. The maturing middle class growing for the next decade over 100 million people. It has by about 130 million over the last decade. Richard's comments and reference was primarily to mobile services, and we're seeing a steady decline in revenues generated from voice. However, the data side is booming. So broadband services and the enablement of physical connectivity, be that enterprise, retail or consumer, and a host of services that could be delivered. By example, in Harare today we provide a $50 a month triple play service that allows the consumer access to internet, data services, voice services, and video on demand as an example. And
so that's diversification right there. So is that the new trend, that if you're going to survive, you've got to actually diversify in terms of the products?
Move up the value chain, push more sophisticated and advanced services into the product set, and I think that's where the African market will move. We're moving beyond the mere voice and messaging and into some sophisticated, funky services.
But does data make financial sense, especially if we're saying there's a data tsunami that's going to be overtaking the continent? Does data make more financial sense if this is where the boom is coming from?
Well, it's the foundation in terms of the internet protocol for all transactions moving forward, whether that be mobile money, as we've seen with M-Pesa, be that for a video on demand or a service of demand. All of your cloud services are driven over your broadband connectivity services. So data underpins the growth that we're experiencing in this economy.
Your view on the voice versus data debate, and whether we are going to see the end of voice or not, given that it's probably still has more of a financial return muscle? It's
still a bit of a no-brainer. The voice market is in decline. It's across the globe. It's in decline. What you will find that voice will become data. So you'll still find that there's a lot of, not a lot, but more of that circuit switch voice, but it will be very little in terms of the entire revenue mix of the operator.
When you say voice becomes data, is something like the WhatsApp calling an example of voice becoming data?
That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but yes, most of the network operators will break that voice, whether it's whatever the call is, they will break that voice down into IP packets and transmit it as IP.
Willem, you mentioned mobile banking as one of the examples of how we've seen diversification. I'm interested in telecoms in the future. So what are we likely going to be able to do off a telecom platform that goes beyond mobile banking as we have it now. And we even now have video on demand on the cell phone. What's the future looking like? What do you think we're likely to experience as consumers?
So certainly an integration of ICT services and telecommunication services. A utilities type model where a consumer connects to a network and then has a bouquet of services that they can consume on demand, right, with very flexible billing systems. That's a key driver that we are seeing. Coming back to Richard's comments on the voice side, it's just another service that's enabled over the same infrastructure, carried over the same common protocol over that network.
I want to come back before we get into. I want to come back to the merger and acquisitive movements around the telecom space. Which seems to be the biggest trend? Are we seeing more in-country consolidations? Are we seeing some of the bigger, braver players looking to consolidate outside of the boundaries of one particular market? How would you describe that play?
Wow, you can see that the nature of the market, as I mentioned, it's maturing, and in that the competitive environment is heating up. Operators are looking at each other for growth, so therefore you can see that market consolidation is going to be a fact of life going forward. However, just who will have the appetite to acquire which operator remains to be seen. I think we'll probably see more of the likes of external foreign investors coming into Africa, looking at the opportunity, buying various network operators.
We have to take a break, but when we come back, I do want your views on the Telecom Cell C big rumor that's no longer a rumor in the market. But let's take a break. I can see that Richard wants to get straight into it. When we come back, we pick up on the merger and acquisition activity around the telecom space in Africa and much, much more. Don't go away. Welcome back to Invest Africa, and still with me in studio, Richard Hurst, Senior Analyst at Ovum, and Willem Marais, Chief Executive Officer of Liquid Telecom South Africa. Welcome back, gentlemen. Before we went to break, I put the rumor that's no longer a rumor on the table. What's your sense? Does it make sense for Telkom?
I think looking at it from an operator such as Telecom, I think they definitely need a mobile play, no matter what. If we look at this market, mobile is the access, so they have to have that. For them to acquire Cell C, it will give them an immediate footprint in terms of network as well as subscribers. So I think it makes some sense for Telkom to actually go down that route. Failing that, you could see that other potential foreign investors are looking around and looking at Cell C. Although they've said publicly they're not, you can be sure that probably they are.
So I'm going to spare you the unfortunate position of having to comment on this rumor, but let's talk about the entry barriers into this space, Willem, because I think I'm aware of a new, much smaller player. I think they call themselves Me You or You Me, that entered into the market earlier this year, and I haven't really seen much of it since their launch. How would you describe the environment when it comes to entry barriers into the industry?
I think certainly in terms of rollout of physical fibre infrastructure, it is a very costly exercise. Obviously, not just the physical trenching and the deployment of the asset, but the planning that goes hand in hand with that. Obviously, applying for the permissions to dig trenches on roads and pavements, being able to manage the overall deployment, and then of course having the customers that you very fast need to sign up to pay back that original capital investment requirements for the
But part of that, of course, is wooing customers that already belong to other networks. Again, I'm not going to mention Cell C as best as I can, but it seems as if the subscriber race is heating up with buying out of customers as one option that's come onto the table. How would you describe the price wars and the fight for market share in the industry?
Yeah, so it really again depends on the type of services that you are taking to market. Some providers are very fortunate that they had first mover advantage, and reference DFA, they've made a significant investment in terms of building up metro and precinct fibre, but they realised that they couldn't do it themselves all, so they needed to go and acquire a company like Conduct. I think what you will find is that in the coming 18-24 months there will be further consolidation in the telecoms market, not just in South Africa but certainly in our neighbouring countries, East Africa, because you can only have so many providers that target the same customer base in a profitable manner.
Back to the hot issues, but let's get your comment in. I see you want to comment, and then I want to talk Vodacom and Neotel in a second.
Willem's dead right. I think services, that's going to be the key, because in the end it's not going to be the technology. The end user, the end enterprise, they're not really too concerned with the technology. They want to understand the service bundle that they get. So it's going to be, the battle is going to be around the service.
Is the Vodacom Neotel relationship going to be a game changer for them, and is it really going to give them more differentiation in the market?
Well, I think the key to the whole Neotel-Vodacom merger acquisition is that Vodacom get those Neotel assets and allow them to play in the enterprise corporate SA space. So that's what it's really all about, using their fibre assets, using their enterprise customers. So it's a changer, but only really in the enterprise space. And on the back of that, we've seen Telecom acquire BCX, so there's a massive consolidation as well as a move up the value chain for that network operator at the same time.
I want us to stay with the consumers for a second, perhaps talk a little bit about Nigeria, where we saw the drop in the oil price having a direct impact on the kind of revenues that a player like MTN was able to pull out of that market. So is the African consumer or the future African consumer really going to be able to drive the revenues that we're looking for?
I think we've set the bar in terms of expectations from the consumer. So let's say hypothetically they're used to spending $5 a month on their mobile services. I think the various macroeconomic effects on them will not alter that. It's one of those defensive services. So there will be a lot of defense from the telco sector, if that makes sense.
And if I could add to that, I think human behaviour has shown that access to information is as critical as clean water, electricity, and other life support systems. So we find that in the markets that we address, that consumers continue spending, regardless of what's happening at the global economic level.
Well, that actually brings me to another point, and this is around the role that Telecom has played in driving financial inclusion. How far beyond the urban centre have we been able to penetrate using telecoms? And in particular, if we're talking about access to information, which makes the assumption that we're also talking about data-driven services and that kind of thing. Has there been a move forward and a shifting of the dial when it comes to financial inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the historic means of banking, i.e. going to a branch or to an ATM to be able to draw cash, deposit, transact, isn't possible in most of the markets that we serve in Africa. Hence why M-Pesa was formed. So it's using your mobile network, which at the last mile is not a physical connection, it uses your radio signal, to be able to transact, right? You can send money from point A to point B, and that even could be cross-border, coming back to the issues around cross-border connectivity and why regulation is so important, because it's not just the flow of voice or data packets, it now becomes the flow of, financial transaction. So certainly telecoms has leapfrogged the way transactions happen on the African continent from a financial perspective.
Insights on M-Pesa in particular, because there's always this ongoing debate that it is successful because of the lack of regulation that allowed it to flourish, and in a market like South Africa it's not likely to see the same success. What are your views on that?
Probably it could see the same success in South Africa, but the issue is that we have the financial institutions and the mobile network operators, and they're battling out as to who's going to own that space, whereas they have to partner. Whereas in Kenya they were able to go on their own almost. They've subsequently changed that model slightly, But it's going to be a matter of partnering with the financial institutions.
Do you think that bottleneck is going to be unlocked? Are those voices going to be able to find each other?
I think eventually it will come that way. Also, let's look at FNB. They've launched their MVNO now.
Yes.
So it's almost as if the two entities are looking at each other, understanding that they're battling for the same customer.
Yeah. Battling for the same customer, I quickly want to talk about smartphones and whether they are participating in the boom of telecoms in this space. What's the description there?
Well, I'd say we've had a massive influx of smartphones across the continent, driven by the Chinese manufacturers dropping the price down to very affordable levels and giving a very good experience for the end user. The last thing you want to do is have a cheap device in the market which gives a shoddy experience for the end user. So there's a massive uptake of smartphones across the market. That's also having a knock-on effect on the services, the applications and the contents that's being driven across the network.
Willem, your insights around the smartphone boom and whether the kind of device that's required in an African context is actually what we're getting, or we're just getting mass cookie cutter, whatever's working in another market being dumped on the continent?
Certainly, smartphones is enabling the consumption of content in a very different way to what we've experienced previously. So think about basic data services, educational, be it Wikipedia, Google searches, or video consumption like a YouTube. Most of your OTT providers, if we look at some of the bigger players, Netflix is a good example, are looking to come into Africa because these devices are enabling the consumer to consume that specific content that is being made available for sale. Referencing what Richard was saying, yes, we have the Chinese devices that are coming in, but they're good quality devices. China has been operating in this continent for a very long time. Most of your core fixed line and mobile operators are utilizing Chinese
Are they going to get cheaper though, Willem? Is the competition going to heat up in favor of the consumer over time?
Well, we certainly hope so.
Yeah. Let's quickly talk about, we've been talking about telcos in the context of business and really a big financial conversation. Let's talk about telcos in the developmental space and whether governments have been able to harness telecommunications to drive development targets. What comes to mind is what Richard just mentioned now, the use of telecom or telco platforms for educational purposes and the like. We talk about paperless hospitals and that sort of thing. Are we able to identify best practice examples on the continent where we can say development and telecommunications have come together quite successfully?
I think there's a number of successful projects underway, and we can pick any African country, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, etc., where there have been some really successful and very good projects, both in the M-Health, E-Education, M-Education, all of those things. So yes, there's definitely some good stories out there.
Is it the same markets though? Is it always the big players, the Nigerias, the Kenyas and the South Africans? Are there new markets that we should be looking out for?
Well, if you look at, again, statistics, 40% of the African population is really centered in Nigeria, East Africa and South Africa. But specifically, if we unpack East Africa, Kenya is the dominant country, but you have 5 member states. And if we look at the tech innovation hubs that is currently being developed in markets like Uganda, Rwanda, quite a significant amount of exports happening in terms of the global ICT market for applications that are being consumed globally.
Well, on that note of telecommunications coming together and converging with policy to drive development, it's a big thank you to Richard Hurst, Senior Analyst at Ovum, and Willem Marais, CEO of Liquid Telecom South Africa. Of course, for you at home, if you'd like to participate in this conversation, you can certainly do that. That's just by tweeting us using the hashtag InvestAfrica, and of course, following me at The Real Nosy. From me and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye for now.